Alright, Ariel. This is the second time I'm trying to record some of these, so we'll see if I'm able to learn anything better. I think I got a few better summaries and stuff to work off, so hopefully I'll be able to get a little more detail without getting too into the weeds for you. But yeah, here we go. So chapter 10 is called Leave Taking. So the group is getting ready to go. Rand, Perrin, Mat, Moiraine, and Lan. And as they start to go, Egwene walks in. And you remember Egwene, that's... and forgive me, I might summarize things because it's been a while since I've talked about it, but Egwene being Rand's love interest. He wasn't married to her, but he was going to be married to her. Everyone in the village knew that they were going to wind up together. And she says she's going to go, and that Perrin and Mat are like bull calves pretending to be foxes. Like, they think they're clever, but they're really just charging ahead without any worry whatsoever. Wheel of Time uses a lot of animal metaphors like that. Moiraine eventually agrees to let Egwene join them, but they don't have a horse for her. And so eventually they're like, well, you can just ride that Gleeman's horse. Suddenly, the Gleeman, Tom, comes out from above them in the hayloft of the barn and says, that's not gonna happen. And eventually, after discussing with him, they allow Tom to come with as well. Tom being a man who wants to be part of these stories so he can tell them. Because that's what a Gleeman is, right? Like a somewhat like a less formal bard, but they're going out and telling stories to people and such. So the group leaves Emond's Valley, Emond's Field, and they're trying to avoid people, right? And they see a patrol of like a dozen men, and they've got spears and axes. Some of them have like scattered pieces of armor because, these guys are farmers. They're not soldiers or anything. And so you can like tell these pieces of armor were like rusted and they were in attics for many, many years, possibly handed down from grandfather to grandfather. So they keep going through the darkness, trying to get out of the village. And they keep finding these different patrols from these different villages. And so Lan has to tell them, like, stop, go. And then as they are out of the village, Rand looks up and sees a giant bird creature. It almost looks like a bat, but far too large to be a bat. Far above, so you can tell that if it were closer, it would be absolutely massive in size. And Lan tells him that's a drag car. And Moiraine, calm in her voice, says if they have a drag car, they will know where we are very, very soon. And then when Rand and them are asking what a drag car is, Tom actually pipes up and talks about how when the breaking of the world happened, at the end of the Age of Legends, there were far worse creatures than Trollocs and Myrddraal Halfman created at that time. And so they continue on, escaping the area and trying to get to safety. Chapter 11 is titled The Road to Terran Ferry. And I'm trying something new too, so I just want to cover, I think each time I do one of these, I just want to mention some important things that maybe my summary didn't hit. But these are kind of important things for character development, right? So one of the things is that Perrin, blacksmith, the largest of the three boys, he's carrying an axe, and Rand is carrying a sword, and Mat is kind of almost not laughing at them for it, but he's skeptical that they need an axe and sword, or at the very least that they know how to use it. Another thing is that Egwene, who is accompanying them now, she doesn't quite believe that the three boys are leaving because they have to. She thinks they just want to charge ahead for adventure. Perrin overheard Lan talking about how there are wolves in the area, and he was caught off guard by that for some reason. We don't really understand why. And then also, Moiraine mentioned that the Trollocs are after Rand, Mat, or Perrin. and that is the reason they have to leave. So Egwene knows this, even if she doesn't quite believe it. All right, so back to chapter 11. They continue on, and they come up to past Watch Hill, and they come across the Taryn. The Taryn is a large river, and there's only one boat that can cross it, and that's the Taryn ferry. So they need to get across, and their horses are just exhausted by this point. So Moiraine goes up to the horses, takes their head in her hands, and they go. She did something to them, but suddenly it seems like they have significantly more energy. Although Rand realizes it looks like Moiraine seems to have a little bit less, even if she's trying not to show it. Moiraine also remarks that Egwene's horse, Bella, seems to be the least tired of them all for some reason, even though her horse isn't made for these types of journeys normally. And so suddenly, as they approach the river, they hear the Drakkar screaming, sounding like a man dying under a bunch of sharp knives, and the horses start panicking and reeling, and everyone's trying to get their horses under control again. Lan commands them to mount back up on top of the horses to get even better control, and knows that Drakkar would not have screamed if it hadn't already reported their position. And so they start galloping, and fog envelops them, and they're riding into this fog, and Moiraine says they're going to try to lose it and through there, and so she goes in. They go through the fog, and they stop hearing the noises eventually, and you get kind of this sense that Moiraine is getting the fog thicker behind them to try to help them lose try to help the bad guys lose track of the group. And so after they go for hours at this, trying to get to the actual point of the ferry, they finally reach it, and they go up there and Lan slams his fist on a door, demanding that the man opens up. And it's the middle of the night, remember, and these people over here don't know anything about the Trolloc attacks, and no one answers, and he bangs. Lan is just this massive dude, bang, 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 until someone finally comes up, and Lan says, we want to cross on your ferry, and gives them a ton of money. He says, the man's like, I'm not going right now. Everyone's asleep. The warder, Lan being Moiraine's warder, gives him a ton of gold coins, says, we'll double it when we get over there. And the man says, all right, and he goes to wake up his people. As far as character development for this chapter, it's just important to note Egwene seems to be enjoying the adventure a little bit more than she otherwise alluded to. So that's about all. Chapter 12 is titled Across the Taryn. So Lan tells everyone, get rid of your cloaks to make sure that everyone else can see that we are armed and we are prepared to defend ourselves. And as they do so, the man with the boat, Master Hightower, comes back with 6 men to operate the boat. And our group starts arming up. Perrin eases the axe in its loop. Rand and Lan get their swords, Matt with his bow, and Tom starts just trimming his fingernails away with a dagger. It seems to make the boatman a little nervous, and he's actually like, hey, the gold that you gave me already is hidden. You won't find it again. And it seems like he thinks the group might rob him. All right, Ariel, interrupting briefly to say this is where you called me, so now I will resume chapter 12. But you know that I love talking to you, and I love you very much. So at this point, they all get on the boat, and they're all on the boat crossing the river, and they're like, the Drakkar is not very smart, according to Moiraine, and so the Myrddraal, now that they're over the river, is probably going to have to divide his forces to find out where they're going and stuff. And so Matt finally asks the question, where are we going? And Moiraine says the only place that you'll be safe, Tar Valon. Or Tar Valon. I might pronounce it both ways. We'll see. I think it's Valon, but I've always called it Tar Valon in my head. So, again, I've never had to say it out loud. But Tar Valon is the White City. It is on the other side of the continent, and that is where all the Aes Sedai live. It's their white tower in the middle of the city that is many, many stories tall, overlooking the entire city, and it's known as a place of power, where the Aes Sedai rule over the kings and queens of all the other nations, where they come to pay tribute to the Aes Sedai. And that is the only place that Moiraine says these children will be safe. And so they get across the pool, and they all get off, across the river, and they all get off the boat. And Lan hands counts them out and hands the coins and says, as agreed. And he pays the men. Suddenly, behind them, they hear a large creaking sound. And the boat, the ferry that they were using, is drifting out to sea, and there's thunderous cracks of snapping wood, and the torches are getting further away, and Tom curses, and the man who owns the ferry, Mr. Hightower, says, "It's loose, it's loose, go get it." And they're like, "Oh man, we can't," the men say, "it's too far away." And then it's at that time they see their ferry was sucked into a spiral. There was a whirlpool that formed within the river, and their voices are filled with awe. They're like, "A whirlpool? There are no whirlpools in the Terran. There's never been one before." And Moiraine's like, "Unfortunate." And Lan says, "Unfortunate. I guess you'll not be carrying anyone else over the river for a while." And then he hands him a bunch more coins to say, "This should repay you." And at this point, it's not implied that Moiraine did it. It's just it's kind of hinted that it may be a possibility here. But it is kind of hinted that maybe she did do it. And so they continue on. And Tom speaks up. He's like, "We should get further away from the river. Keep going. So you don't have to so we don't, we'll be a little safer." And Moiraine's looking at him, and he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, Aes Sedai. I didn't mean to offend you or anything." Because people are really scared around Aes Sedai. They're so powerful, right? And so at this point, they get far enough away, and they make a campfire, and they set up camp. And Moiraine starts talking about the One Power for the first time. And she tells Egwene starts telling this story about how when she was younger, she had a fever, and she was on the verge of death from this fever. And Nynaeve was able to help her through it and stuff like that, and she got better. And Moiraine, is perking up, and she's like, "That means you have the ability to use the One Power. You were born with it." So she says only 1 in 4 people who have that fever survive. And it sounds like Egwene was a person that had it. And so Moiraine says this means you can channel. And Egwene is like, "Oh, I can channel." And so Moiraine holds up this stone and says, "Just focus on it. Like, imagine yourself as a rosebud and allow, the light from the sun to flow into you, and just accept the sun into your rose petals." And so Egwene stares at it, and she does her best, and she sees a small flicker of light appear in the blue stone. And Moiraine says, "That's something that people can't do after they've been in the White Tower for months." And Egwene then says, Egwene is now questioning, am I going to be an Aes Sedai now? And Moiraine says that she will take Egwene to the tower to train her to be an Aes Sedai. So that's the end of that chapter. The other things worth mentioning that are relevant for later, but I didn't quite get into, Moiraine gets into the Ajahs. And so this is super important. The White Tower is divided into 7 different Ajahs, and these are, think of them like clans within the White Tower. So they split them into colors: red, blue, white, green, brown, yellow, and gray. And so those are the 7 Ajahs, and they all have different things. But what they were saying was the red Ajah dedicates themselves to hunting down male channelers and gentling them. And she talks about gentling is when the red Ajah find a man who can channel, and they sever his ability to touch the One Power. And this is called gentling them, because they put that term on it because you remember male channelers are, if they touch the One Power, they go mad, right? Because the Dark One touched it and tainted it. And so they have to go around stopping male channelers from developing their powers, else they could break the world, just like Lews Therin Telamon did 3,000 years ago. And so Moraine is talking about, trying to gentle Logain, who was a false dragon who appeared, that was captured by the White Tower recently. And he's being gentled. And then another thing that comes up is that she mentions there's a nation called Tyr, which is way to the south, and she's talking about how in prophecies there's this sword that cannot be touched and will only be touched by the Dragon Reborn, and that's a thing for later. But yeah, that's it for that chapter. Chapter 13 is titled Choices. So at this point, Moraine takes everyone's head in her hands one by one and uses the one power to give them energy. Egwene being the only one who's excited about it. No one else really wants to be touched by the power. So Lan scouts ahead, and he's teaching Rand how to fight with a sword, Perrin how to fight with his axe, and Mat a little bit of it as well. And he notes, like, they're all really good with bows, but he really focuses on the melee weapon type thing. And basically, they start traveling for days, and every night, Moraine and Egwene sneak off in the middle of the night together. And Rand eventually gets very curious about it, and so he follows them sneakily. And he overhears their conversation, where Moraine is telling Egwene, teaching her about the one power, and how it's actually split into 5 powers. So the female half of the one power, actually the male half as well, is divided into these 5 elements. There's fire, water, earth, air, and spirit. And in order to create magic, to use their powers, they have to weave together these elements into a pattern that creates what they need. So for instance, if you want to erupt the ground, you would use lots of earth threads, right? They call it threads of the one power. So you would send out a bunch of earth threads and combine them in a way that makes the earth erupt. But if you wanted to make lava come up or something, you would have to use earth and fire together, right? To create that. And so Egwene, hearing about all this, is getting scared. She basically asks Moraine, like, can you just confirm for me that the Aes Sedai are not evil, and that it was the men who broke the world? And Moraine says, well, yes, they did. It was the men that broke the world, but they weren't evil. They were insane. They lost their ability to think because the Dark One touched it. And she says, the Aes Sedai are still human, and there's brave and cowardly people among them, right? And finally they notice Rand back there, and Rand kind of scampers away. And that's it for that night. Something else worth mentioning here that I didn't talk about earlier was that everyone has a lot of trouble placing the age of Moraine. She's a very short, brown-haired woman, but the Aes Sedai, she has told us by this point, have ageless faces. Using the one power, elongates your life way beyond that of a normal person, to the point where it's very difficult for someone to determine your age. So no one really knows how old Moraine is. So they keep traveling for a while. They come into this city, and they're like, oh yeah, there were White Cloaks here. Nobody really wants them here. They haven't caused too much trouble, whatever. And then there's another man in Gildan claiming to be the Dragon Reborn, and he's got an army that is going towards the nation of Tyr right now. And so this is a separate dragon from Logain, who I mentioned previously was gentled. So now there's 2 false dragons, one of which has already been captured and gentled, and one of which is in control of an army to the south. And so Rand is asking, he asked Tom, actually, why is Tyr important? Why would this false dragon be marching there? And Tom tells Rand of the Carathian cycle. It's a series of prophecies about the Dragon Reborn, and one of the things it says is that the nation of Tyr has something called the Stone of Tyr. It's a giant building that's impenetrable. Many nations have tried to conquer Tyr and fallen because they cannot infiltrate the Stone of Tyr. It is just a remarkable fortress. But the prophecy says that the fall of the Stone of Tyr will only occur when the dragon has been reborn. And these prophecies obviously stick to Rand's mind, right, as they continue. Because at this point, we find out that Moiraine, and maybe I've talked about this in a previous recording, but if not, Moiraine has told Rand, Mat, and Perrin that they are not just ordinary boys. They are what are called ta'veren. So ta'veren are individuals that twist the pattern of the world around them. So when things happen to either, how do I phrase this? There is normal people going about their lives, right? Doing normal things, living normal lives like us. And then there are the ta'veren, and these people twist the fabric of reality around them. Not intentionally necessarily, but just by existing and just by being in a place, they twist reality to form the vision that the pattern has for them. So it's not an active choice by the ta'veren to say, hey, we want this to happen, and so reality now warps to it. It is the pattern itself, the fabric of reality trying to find balance. And according to Moiraine, Mat, Perrin, and Rand are all ta'veren, just like Arthur Hawkwing was 1,000 years ago, who was Arthur Hawkwing in the lore is basically this general who took over most of the continent, and he was called the most powerful ta'veren that has ever been known in history. And eventually he and his army sailed across the sea, never to be seen again, kind of thing. And so Rand continues the conversation with Tom also, and talks about how the other prophecy relevant to Tyr is that the stone will not fall until the sword that cannot be touched is wielded by the dragon. And so apparently there is a sword in Tyr that nobody has the ability to touch except for the dragon. At this point, I also want to mention, just to go back, that when Lan was training the boys in their weapons, Rand actually surprised Lan, because Rand was very good with his sword. And when Lan was asking, like, how are you so good, Rand was talking about the void. And what Rand basically does is he pictures a small flame in the middle of darkness, and he focuses on that flame. That flame is him, and the void around him is nothingness, and it allows him to have full concentration on whatever he's doing. It's a trick that his dad, Tam, taught him, and it helps him with the bow. Well, apparently it helps him with the sword as well. The other thing to mention is that Moiraine, when talking to Egwene, talks about the 3 oaths. So apparently, all Aes Sedai are bound to 3 promises that can never be broken because they are magically bound to them. These are, number 1, to speak no word that is not true. Number 2, to make no weapon with which one person may kill another. And 3, never to use the one power as a weapon, except in the last defense of her own life, the life of her warder, or another Aes Sedai. And basically, Moiraine explains these are intended to give people faith that they can deal honestly with the Aes Sedai. And it was a sacrifice that the Aes Sedai made after the breaking of the world so that people wouldn't lump them in with the men that destroyed the world. So that is where it comes from, that Aes Sedai can never lie. That doesn't mean that you always get the truth you hear, like that, or the truth you think you hear, because they're very wily with their statements and very ambiguous sometimes. But if they say something and you know for sure, like they mean it, you know it's true. And then it also means they will not just attack people with the one power. So that's another important piece of lore. But that's it for this chapter. Chapter 13 is titled The Stag and Lion. So they go into a town, Bearlawn, and they're like, Rand, Matt, Perrin, and Egwene are like, oh my god, this is the biggest town we've ever seen. This is a grand city. And Moraine, Land, and Tom are like, huh, this is like a tiny little place, but it's way bigger than their tiny village. So it's just, a matter of reference. Because remember, the kids have, not kids, the main group here has never left the Two Rivers before. So they get some rooms, and Rand notices Moraine talking to this very short-haired girl in like trousers and a shirt, dressed like a boy, which is very unusual in this world. Girls don't wear pants, right? They're always in like dresses and skirts and stuff. And so that person sticks out to him. So eventually they get some food. They're like, we're going to stay in this town for a couple days as long as you guys are careful, and, we'll rest, recover, get the horses recovered. So they go to bed. And Rand, in his dream, sees Baalzamon, a man with eyes of flame and dark clothing. And Baalzamon asks Rand if he was told that the eye of the world would serve Rand, and says that the Amyrlin seat will use Rand until there is nothing left. And Rand is scared and realizes this is the Dark One, Baalzamon. But he's bound in Sheo Ghul. He can't be here. And Baalzamon says he's never been bound. He was with Lews Therin Kinslayer when he killed everyone he cared for, and he whispered in Otter Hawkwing's ear, and Aes Sedai died because of it. And High King sent his armies across the Aerith Ocean, dooming his dream of being a single king over the continent. Rand says this is a dream, and Baalzamon starts curving his finger and breaks a rat's back that is in the corner of the room in which he's dreaming. And then he bends another finger and starts to break Rand's back just to prove to him that this is not a dream. And suddenly, Rand awakes, and he sees Tom and Lan in the room. He's asleep, and he's like, oh man, I don't know if that was real. Maybe Moraine can help me with these dreams, and if I can trust her. And then he falls back asleep. Alright, the next chapter, chapter 15, is titled Strangers and Friends. So Rand wakes up and finds pretty much everyone's gone. He asks the innkeeper, like, where'd everyone go? He's like, oh yeah, everyone just went into town except for one of your friends who wasn't feeling good. So Rand starts going into the rooms and sees Perrin's in there. And Perrin's like, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not feeling well. I had some really bad dreams and couldn't get to sleep. And they start wondering if maybe Matt had a bad dream too. When Rand goes downstairs, he meets a girl, the short-haired girl in the trousers, and she introduces herself as Min, and she starts telling him that she has a power. It's not the one power. It's something new, something different, not ever heard of before. When she looks at people, she can see symbols above their heads, and these symbols can be interpreted and tell her what will happen to that person in the future. Essentially, she says she can see the pattern. And Min is very surprised. She realizes, I didn't mean to tell you any of this. I don't know why I did. And Rand doesn't really understand either, not really believing that he is ta'veren yet. And he alters chance and probability just by existing near someone. So Min just tells him, all right, well, I can see that you and your two young men with you are all tied together in the pattern. Rand asks about Egwene, and Min's like, oh yeah, her too, and I can see that you and her love each other very much, but you are not meant for each other, and you will not be together, not in the way that you want. Rand then asks, what do you see above me? And Min says she sees 3 women standing over a funeral pyre with him on it, with the black rock wet with blood. And Rand breaks in, says, that's enough. I don't want to hear this. And Rand starts panicking a little bit inside. Rand leaves Min after that conversation, and he goes into the town, and he spots Paden Fain. And Paden Fain, if you remember, was the man, the peddler from Eamon's Field. And he runs away, and Rand follows him. And he talks about how he's been running since the Trolloc attack. And Rand's like, we thought you were dead. Rand's like, you come back with me, we'll talk to Moraine, we can help you. And Fain's like, don't even tell them I'm alive. Don't say you saw me. And Rand promises, and Fane runs away. As After Fane runs away, Rand encounters Mat, and they have a conversation and find out they were having the same dream. And then they go back to the inn together. And as they go back, they see white cloaks, men that say they serve the light and hunt dark friends. Dark friends being people that serve the Dark One, people that have sold their souls essentially for the promise of eternal life, power, or even just safety from the Dark One's machinations. So the White Cloaks are definitely opposed to the Dark One. But Mat thinks they're pretty full of themselves. He goes up on a rooftop, uses a slingshot, and he breaks a bunch of barrels that roll and splash a bunch of mud on the White Cloaks. And Rand starts laughing down on the street, and the children see him and are like, "Oh," and Rand's like, "Oh shit, man, I didn't do it." And they see Rand has a sword, and they're like, what's going on here? And one of the men introduces himself as Bornhold, who asks Rand what evil is in him that he refuses to answer his questions. And then he tells Rand, dark friends will not escape us. But eventually they don't get anything out of Rand, and so they move on. Rand and Mat then encounter Tom, and they start telling Tom about their dream with Ba'alzamon, who's like, don't say that anywhere where anyone else could hear. Like, let's do this in private, dude. What the fuck is wrong with you? So they all go back to the inn and go to Perrin. And Perrin's like, oh, I was looking for you guys. Nynaeve came in, and she's inside the inn. So that's the end of that chapter. So just a couple things that are important. Some of the viewings that Min saw, she saw 7 towers circling around Lan. She saw Lan as a child in a cradle holding a sword. Min saw a red eagle flying around Mat. The red eagle, as Moraine said earlier, was the symbol of Manatharin, which used to be the 2 rivers, if you remember my very long reading before. Also for Mat, she saw an eyeball sitting on a balance scale, like the scales of justice kind of thing, right? Where you weigh things. So she saw an eyeball resting on one. She also saw a dagger with a ruby and a very fancy horn. For Perrin, Min saw a wolf, a broken crown, and trees blooming around Perrin. And then the other thing important to note is that throughout this whole time, Rand has not been feeling super well. He's been feeling a little sick. So he's starting not to feel very good. Chapter 16 is titled The Wisdom. So as they found out Nynaeve, the wisdom of Emond's Field, has arrived in the inn, Min pulls Rand aside and said, this girl is tied up in it too. But Min makes him promise not to tell people about her power. And so he decides, I will keep that promise and I will hold my tongue. So they all sit down with Nynaeve, and Lan comes in too, and they're like, how did you find us? And she's like, I followed your trail. And Lan is like, you followed my trail? Like, Lan being like super untrackable by any normal human, covering up his tracks perfectly. And he's like, I must be getting careless. And so Rand tells her, like, we're going to Tar Valon for safety right now. And they start talking about what the best thing to do is. And so Moraine tells everyone at this point, everyone out, except for Nynaeve. Me and her are going to talk with each other 1v1. So everyone else walks out, and after a while, Nynaeve comes outside, and she tells them, like, yeah, the village, the people that were left in the village came together. The village is pretty much destroyed, and the village agreed, like, someone has to go get our children, Rand, Mat, Perrin, and Egwene. And so they sent out Nynaeve to do so. Rand at this point decides to ask Nynaeve about what Tam said about not being Rand's true father. And she just says, people say weird things when they're in a fever. They can say things that aren't true. And she doesn't elaborate anything more on that, except for she said when Tam returned to Emond's Field, so he went out into the world at some point, he brought back a red-haired wife and a babe. And Carrie Althor, being Rand's mother's name, took care of that baby, which was Rand. And so Rand asks her, like, well, what are you going to do now? She's like, we'll see. Important things to note. Everyone tells Nynaeve at this point, like, we're not going back to Emond's Field, man. Like, we're not doing it. I don't care that you came sent back. Nynaeve also blushes pretty hot when Lan praises how good Nynaeve's tracking skills are. But Nynaeve also does not seem to like Moiraine, does not really trust her. Chapter 17 is titled Watchers and Hunters. So Rand goes back into the inn and sees Tom is actually performing inside, and he's telling them a bunch of cool stories, like the great hunt for the horn and stuff. And then eventually everyone clears the area and starts dancing. And Rand actually dances with Nynaeve, Moiraine, and Egwene before getting tired and sitting back down. And I think at this point it's implied, like, dancing is not inherently romantic. They're just honestly having fun and trying to unwind a little bit. So Rand goes into the kitchen to get some food or some milk or something. And as he goes in by himself, a Fade walks out from the shadows. A Fade being a Myrddraal, remember. Rand wants to run, but he can't break free from the eyeless pits within the face of the Myrddraal. And the Myrddraal says that Rand belongs to the great Lord of the Dark, and then it disappears into the shadows. Lan leaps down into the stairs into the kitchen with his sword as soon as Rand tells him what happened, and they all agree to leave immediately, and they start making their way for Camlin, the capital of Andor, because that's their major city stop on the way to the White Tower. And they're trying to they get to the gates of the city, and they're trying to convince the guards to open the gate, and they're like, why do you want to leave in the middle of the night? And then Bornhald and his White Cloaks come, and they realize, oh my god, she's an Aes Sedai, and they unsheathe their swords and attack Moiraine, and she blocks the White Cloaks' attacks with her staff, and they fall backwards. They all get through the gate, but when Rand turns back, he sees Moiraine. Her head is taller than the wall of the gate itself, and they keep running and watch Moiraine step right over the wall, and when her feet are on the ground outside, she reverts back to her normal size. Bornhald commands the watchmen to keep the gates open, but they don't listen. They close it in fear and seal the White Cloaks inside the city. Egwene is flabbergasted by what she saw, Moiraine turning into a giant, and Moiraine just says, the mind plays tricks at night and sees what's not really there. And so they start moving down the road at not a super fast pace, because the gate's closed, so they don't have to worry. And an hour later, they see flames over the horizon back towards the city they came from, and Moiraine tells them that's the inn. And Nynaeve gets angry at Moiraine, saying, how could we leave them like this? But Moiraine just says, before we left, I gave the innkeeper enough gold to rebuild the entire inn. And so they continue on. They sleep with their bedrolls and their saddles. They start riding again. They eat breakfast in the saddle, and they keep going again and again. And all the while, Lan looking around as if he expects an ambush at any moment. Chapter 18 is titled The Camlin Road. So 3 days pass in this way, with them traveling as quickly as they can. And Lan eventually says, we have Myrddraal and Trollocs on our tail, and they know where we are heading. And the group, at some point, realizes this is true when they hear the horn of a Trolloc in the distance. Blowing, going... Lan breaks off from the group and heads in another direction, Moiraine saying, the light go with you, last lord of the Seven Towers. And they all continue on their own, no one else understanding what Lord of the Seven Towers means. And they hear the horn again. Maybe 7 or 8 miles behind them. Nynaeve is like, we gotta go faster. And Moiraine says, no, we can't do that. We'll tire the horses. We have to keep going the same pace. And as they progress, they keep hearing the horn. And they're 5 miles away, getting closer every time they hear it. And Lan suddenly comes galloping over the hill behind them and says there are tons of Trollocs, maybe 5 fists of them, each led by a half-man. They're closing the gap and will be there in under an hour. As they progress, they hear the horn again, and suddenly the Trollocs are upon them. One of the Fades unsheathes its sword and rides right towards Lan, followed by a bunch of Trollocs. And Lan, the warder, shouts, "For the Seven Towers!" And the rest of the group runs after Lan, and Rand, all caught up in the moment, screams, "Manatharin, Manatharin," as Perrin does. And Mat shouts out, "Carian Caldazar, Carian Caldazar, Alisande," which were names and shouts from the story that Moraine told. They all fight using the skills that Rand taught them, but Lan and the Myrddraal fighting in a circle where no one else interferes. Nynaeve and Egwene are staying with Moraine, who's shooting fire out at the Trollocs using her staff that she carries, while Rand is using his sword while on horseback, trying to prevent the Trollocs from unhorsing them. And suddenly, all the Trollocs fall onto the ground, shouting, and he turns towards Lan and sees the Myrddraal sitting in the saddle without a head. Tom yells out that Myrddraal's not going to die until nightfall, but Lan says, "Yup, let's go. Let's leave right now." And then they hear more horns. Om, 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 from 3 different directions, west, east, and south. And there's only like 100 strides between all the Trollocs and him. Moraine climbs out of her saddle of her horse and takes out a small figure. And this is something that she talked about earlier, that was an Angriel, something that enhances the use of the one power. It's how she was able to heal so many of the villagers on that first night of Beltane. And she takes the Angriel, and with her other hand in the staff, she faces 3 Fades and a bunch of Trollocs. She raises her staff up, stabs it into the earth, causing the ground to tremble, ripple, and the Trollocs tumble down the slope of the hill that they're on, and the Myrddraal try to move forward, but their horses still manage to do it, and she lifts her staff and the earth stands still. And then she points at a place in the hill, and flames spreading as far as the eye can see, with a giant wall between the party and the Trollocs. And it's at this point Moraine nearly falls over before Lan catches her. And Moraine says she'll be fine. She's just not using the earth and fire weaves are not her strong suit. And so Lan helps her ride on. And they start talking again now that they're out of the immediate danger. Like, Egwene's like, "Why did you yell Manatharin and stuff?" And he's like, "That's just what you do in times like that." And she's like, "Men." And that's at that point they hear the horns blowing again. Aum. And Lan says the Trollocs must have passed the wall of fire, and Moraine has no strength left. She has to rest. And they see a city. And there is clear dread in Lan and Moraine's eyes as they look at it, and they say that neither Myrddraal nor Trolloc will enter this city. Moraine sighs and agrees with Lan and says everyone stay as close to me as possible. She starts swinging the staff over them and thrusts it out, and she says she has moved their scents a different direction in the hopes that the Trollocs will follow it another way. And then they keep going and see the city. It's at least 50 times as large as Baerlon, which was the largest city they had ever seen in their lives at that point. And everyone's wondering, what is this place? And Moraine tells Egwene and the group, this city was called Eridhall. It was an ally to Manatharin during the Trolloc Wars. But later, this place died and received another name, Shadar Logoth. Chapter 19 is titled Shadows Waiting. As they go into the town, Rand is just flabbergasted by the sight of the city. It is absolutely massive, and he has a ton of embarrassment thinking how Tom, Lan, and Moraine must have been laughing their butts off when everyone was like, wow, Baerlon was such a grand city. And he sees there's these giant domes and fountains and statues and towers everywhere, and yet it's all empty. They go into a white building that's twice the size of any inn they've ever seen, and they bring the horses inside. They ask Nynaeve if she has any herbs that can help, because she is the wisdom of the village and she's a healer. And so the wisdom, Nynaeve starts brewing a tea for them, something that'll help Moraine sleep, but not leave her groggy for if she's needed. So they're sitting in there, and Matt is like, well, why don't we at least go see some of the city? And so they agree. The boys go out and, well, specifically Rand and Matt decide we're going to go out and look at the city a little bit. And so they wander into some buildings and they really don't find anything. There's just rubble and dust everywhere. The city's clearly been abandoned for many, many years, uncountable years. Rand decides, I want to go back to sleep. But Matt's like, well, there could be treasure here. We should get some. Let's climb up one of the towers. Suddenly they hear a man's voice that says, the towers are not safe. They ask the man who he is, and he says, I'm Mordeth, a treasure hunter. They tell Mordeth that they're going to Camlin, and he says, can you help me carry a treasure I found? I will give you some. And they say, okay. So he leads them into the building, and there's just giant amounts of treasure. Jewels, coins, goblets, platters, swords, gems, all kinds of things. And they say, we'll come back tomorrow, and, we'll come back. And Mordeth's like, are you alone? And Matt's like, no, we have other people. We're going to Tar Valon. Mordeth's face twists in rage and says, you're lying to me. And, actually, Perrin is here. And he actually pulled out his axe in fear. But he put it back when things calmed down a little bit. And then Rand is like, Rand looks a little closer and he realizes what's really throwing him off with Mordeth. Mordeth doesn't have a shadow. Mordeth says, it is decided. And he grows like a balloon. They start panicking, and suddenly Mordeth is sitting in the corner of the room, clutching his knees to his chest, and he shouts, you are all dead! And he disappears. They run out up the steps and back into the streets. They go into the middle, and suddenly they get through the doorway, and everyone except for Lan is there. Moraine asks in a panic, like, what has happened? And they start to tell her. They're all trying to talk at once, talking over each other and not telling it in the order at all. And Moraine just grabs Rand's wrist at the mention of Mordeth and asks if he gave them anything or touched them at all. They say no, and Matt says, I thought it was safe in the city since the Trollocs wouldn't be here. And she starts telling them a story. Thousands of Trollocs, dark friends, Myrddraal, and Dreadlords that had camped in this city late in the Trolloc Wars, and they never came out. She starts telling them how a man named Mordeth came to Eredhall at the point where it seemed like the Dark One was surely going to conquer the world. Mordeth spoke to the king of Eredhall, and soon Mordeth was second only to the king. He was the number 2 in the entire country. And Eredhall destroyed itself in war and called itself Shadar Logoth, Shadows Waiting. And at that point, the city is known to be cursed forever. And there's a lot of depth into this curse, Ariel, but I'm trying to keep it as short as I can. So they go to sleep, but they're woken up upon Lan coming in. And Lan says, there are Trollocs in the gates, and he starts waking everyone up. And they say, we're going to make for the river, and we'll create some rafts to cross or get a boat to from coming up from up north. And Lan's like, Trollocs and Myrddraal can't swim, so they won't go into the deep water. They get their horses, and they bug out. Chapter 20 is titled Dust on the Wind. So this is the first chapter with a split perspective. So you're going to hear things from Rand's point of view and Perrin's point of view in one. So as a group, Lan is leading them down the streets as they try to escape the city, and Lan tells them stay out of the shadows. And he sees that the group is falling behind Lan and Moraine, and he speeds up and sees a tendril of fog drifting across the street ahead of him. The Aes Sedai, Moraine, shouts, "Stop!" And he does, and the fog completely covers the street, and it grows slowly. Lan and Moraine ride back to the fog, and when Nynaeve asks what it is, the Aes Sedai tells her it is Mashadar, the evil of Shadar Logoth, and it kills you by a mere touch, and not even the entire power of all the Aes Sedai in the White Tower could destroy it. Moraine points up to the sky and a star that she sees and says, "Follow that star. It'll bring you to the river." And she rides off with Lan, leaving the rest to find another route. As they turn around and go down another street, Trollocs appear right in front of them, and another pair, and another, and they start howling out loud, oh, with all their animal-like faces, boar faces, bird faces, all kinds of things. And Matt at this point, seeing the Trollocs too, very nervous as well, and Rand actually meets up with Matt because everyone got separated by the fogs at this point, and they ride out of the gates, and suddenly Tom appears. So Tom, Matt, and Rand are all together, and Tom yells, "We have to ride faster, go, go, go!" And Rand hears the Trollocs hunting them behind as they sprint out of the city as fast as they can. Then the perspective shifts to Perrin. Perrin looking at the gate out of the city, and he sees Egwene come up to him, and he rides out to meet him, and they ride out of the city and hear a Trolloc horn behind them, and the Trollocs start howling. Perrin and Egwene sprint into a gallop, but Egwene's horse falls behind, and then they run whoosh right into the water, and the Trollocs start throwing spears, and they're floating downriver. They're trying to swim against the current or to get to a bank, and eventually he reaches it, and he calls out for people, but he gets no answer from anybody. Back to Rand and Tom and Matt. Matt shoots an arrow into the eye of a Trolloc that they find, and they continue on to the river. They decide to go downriver, and they find a trader who has a boat. And as he's questioning Rand about what they're doing here, Trollocs burst out, and they run onto the boat and waken the crew. Everyone tries to fight the Trollocs, and they get the boat out into the water. And the captain gets very angry with one of the crew members who was asleep when he was supposed to be watching for danger. Rand tells the boat captain, "We have to go back and get our friends." And the man introduces himself as Bael Domon, captain of the Spray being his ship. Tom says that he is a gleeman and that Matt and Rand are his gleeman apprentices. And he goes on and he tells this fake story about why they're here. He says, "We don't have a lot of money." The captain's like, "Well, I see that boy, Rand, has a sword. You can give me that." And Rand's like, "No." So Matt and Rand actually hand him the silver coins they got from Moraine. And Domon says, "Well, for this, I'll take you all the way to Whitebridge down the river." And Tom, once they're alone, Tom gets mad at them and says, "I could have just done songs and stories if you hadn't given up your money so quickly." And he's all angry about it. But eventually they calm down, and Tom realizes Rand is brooding and says, "Don't worry, the others are probably safe."